Doing a video response for Class 5 in the Theodicy elective on Holocaust, Theodicy, and Theology in the same week when the hostages have now been released by Hamas. And it would seem that the beginnings of this awful tragedy that has gone on for more than 2 years is now hopefully beginning to come to an end is sort of an interesting coincidence of big epical events, to use the term that some of the Holocaust thinkers have used, both Fackenheim and Yitz Greenberg. Rabbi Patrick, with respect to your questions, the first thing I need to say is that my theology has certainly concretized over the course of my time at PRS. I'm not exactly sure how I'd label myself at this point, but I am not a believer in a transcendental God who acts in history, who has reasons for acting in history, and I no longer believe God was acting. I no more believe that God was acting in history during the Holocaust than he or she or they were acting in tragic moments in any person's life or my family life or with the tragic deaths of so many of the Israeli hostages and innocent Palestinians during the course of the Gaza war. Simply not my conception of God. So in a certain way, the theodicy question, as you pose it with respect to the Holocaust, it just doesn't quite align with my perspective on who or what God is and how God operates in the world. It's interesting, though, that the Oxford English Dictionary definition of theodicy is the vindication of divine goodness and providence in the face of evil. The definition sort of eliminates the question of the power of God, the omnipotence of God. And if you take the omnipotence of God out of the theodicy question during the Holocaust, you can imagine a God who's present, who's compassionate, who I think, in the words of Hans Jonas, or in the conception of Hans Jonas, is suffering with his people, who's compassionate, who's there actually as a source of comfort, which is very much aligned with Kushner's thinking in his assessment of suffering and theodicy. God can be a resource and a comfort when suffering is occurring. And in many ways, I think that this view of a non-judging God, a non-punishing God, but a God who's really an idea that creates connection and meaning and love in the world, community in the world, is where my own theology has evolved to over the past almost 3 years that I've been matriculating at BRS. So, as far as which theodicies are most appealing to me, I'm sort of in this camp of those. They're not really theodicies, but they're really beliefs that God is able to be present through human goodness and through, in effect, the mitzvot and teaching about human goodness in an aspirational way. And so I'm not really accepting in the Fackenheim view or the Yitz Greenberg view, although Yitz's view of this sort of partnership in the final phase post-Holocaust of a sort of a junior partner God and an optional covenant might align a little bit more with his thinking, almost like the image of God as a wise elder who's there to provide wisdom and comfort and support in the face of tragedy and suffering. And isn't actively driving the story, but is a resource, is almost a pastoral caregiver, is the way that the theodicies that I'm drawn to as I struggle with this question. As far as whether the Shoah or Job is, which of those I'm more comfortable thinking about in theological terms, I suppose the answer is Job, although, again, since I'm not believing in a God who's acting in history in the way that term traditionally means, it's almost as if the question is not quite relevant. But if I think about the question with that kind of transcendental conception of God, then I'm more comfortable thinking about Job theologically because it's a parable, it's a myth. The characters have a role to play. I can imagine Job being in the canon because the rabbis intended to have us think about these issues from a theological point of view. The Shoah, to me, as one of the authors or writers commented, is not about God. It is about the ultimate human evil. And that evil is not because of God. I might say that it's stunning and still mind-boggling to cope with. You almost can imagine those thinkers who talk about the mystery of God and God's face not being present, that almost God's reaction to what was happening was confusion, dismay, powerlessness. So I think of the Shoah issue not as theology, but as sociology. And then finally, where was God during Auschwitz? During the death of all those innocents? God was crying. He was weeping. He was imagining that this creation that he was in part responsible for was out of control. And by conceptualizing the creation with free will, he had no capacity to control evil, simply run amok. So this is such a hard topic, obviously. I'm still working through this and probably will for the rest of my life. And as a rabbi, I almost need to conceive of God as a God of compassion who doesn't judge, but who embraces, and maybe that is more the Raphaela conception of God as the Shekhinah, and that this is the path for ultimate tshuva, is that God is welcoming us back and able to comfort us in our moments of suffering.